the reason we've moved so far that way, I blame conservative cowardice. We have not had conservative politicians prepared to stand up and take the abuse. And believe you me, the levels of abuse you get now from the well-funded, organised left are of a different magnitude to anything we've seen before in politics.
I now call the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage.
Well, I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad. Delighted to have Nigel Farage with me today. Welcome to Kuala Lumpur.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Isn't this a wonderful place?
Extraordinary. I mean, one of the things, of course, that's going on in the world is this massive transfer of power, money, and influence that's going from the West to the East. And boy, don't you see it here.
Yeah.
Don't you see it here? And of course, just down the road, Singapore. It's just remarkable, the speed and pace at which these places are developing.
Well, as we were talking earlier, it wasn't that long ago, so we're roughly 60 years in Singapore, kicked out of the Malay Foundation. I'm going to be talking at Nomad Capitalist Live 2024 about Andrew being 40 years old this year. And 40 years ago, Singapore is on the ascent, and now they're the most free place economically on the face of the earth in a relatively short period of time. Andrew's talked about Malaysia in 1984, the year of his birth, being a backwater. Yeah. You come here now, it's no backwater.
Well, the funny thing about Singapore is, there was this campaign for Singaporean independence, and I think, the Malays got a bit tired of it all. And anyway, but one of the funny things is, the biggest argument against Singapore becoming independent is it wasn't big enough, it wasn't strong enough, it couldn't possibly survive. So it won't surprise you to know that during the Brexit campaign, I used Singapore as an example. Interesting, you look at these countries and why they're doing so well. And I think there are two standout reasons. One is education, and the right sort of education for the world we're living in the 21st century, by which I mean a big emphasis on science, mathematics, engineering, those kind of things.
So STEM.
Absolutely,
yes,
absolutely. And the second is culture, work culture. We've got a new business secretary in Britain, a chap called Reynolds. And by the way, he's never had a job, never had a proper job. I mean, trained as a lawyer, didn't practice as a lawyer, worked in, MPs' back offices, career politician. And he says he wants to end the culture of presenteeism, meaning you don't need to turn up to the office. I mean, you can surely, work at home, and we have a something for nothing culture. If you're young, you can choose to just not work and take a bit of money off the government and smoke drugs, and that's fine, absolutely great. And where's the ambition? Where's the drive? Where's the desire to get on? And that's what I see in the East and the Far East, is I see, and my son lives out here, he's moved out here for
He lives in Singapore?
He lives in Hong Kong, in fact.
Hong Kong.
And he's chosen to go there. And,
yes.
All right, it's a bit repressive politically,
yeah.
But he's come because he wants to get on. He wants to do well. He doesn't want to be taxed at some ludicrous rate, which many young professionals in Britain fall into. But it's this work culture, and we're losing it in the West. And, welfarism, we're seeing it in America too. Welfarism, which was designed in a civilized society to help those that were falling down and couldn't help themselves, has now become a glass ceiling on aspiration, where you finish up actually being penalized if you get off benefits and go back to work. So
your tax rate might be over 100% at that point.
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
And so I think one of the reasons places like this do well, the right education, and as I say, work culture and ambition.
So let's talk briefly about the fact that, we'll say kids, and I don't want to just pick on the kids, because ultimately it wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if the older generations wouldn't have permitted it, but that's another story. So let's talk about AI for a moment. I can't say that I truly understand it, but if we had AI and all these jobs went away, well, isn't that maybe what they're getting us ready for in terms of UBI handing out money?
It's possible.
What is your view?
It's possible.
Where are we going with this?
It's possible, but we've had a whole series of technological changes since the birth of man. And you think about over the last few centuries about new industrial techniques are developed, and that means there are fewer workers needed, and does it mean no one's ever going to find any jobs? And actually that gets replaced by something else, and the coal mines all close in England in the 80s, and are these men ever going to do work again? And yet suddenly there are new service industries, other things that crop up. And I feel the same about AI. I mean, there are certain jobs that are doomed. I mean, take journalism. Say you have a newspaper or a TV company that's run, it's got 100 members of staff in the room. With AI, they can do it with 5 or do it with 10. I mean, and I've literally watched this work. I've watched put a news story into an AI system, ask it to produce this result or that result, ask it to be geographically relevant to one area or another, and your basic hack doesn't have a future. But there'll still be room for opinion. There'll still be room for reflection. And it's the same with driverless cars. I mean, think of the number of people that earn a living driving buses, driving trains, driving cars. It's possible that driverless cars replace all those people. But something else comes along.
So is this a form of creative destruction?
Yeah, I think it probably is.
Yeah.
I think it probably is. So I'm not going to get too hung up. I'm not going to get too depressed about this because we've already in this conversation talked about worklessness and how awful worklessness is for people psychologically. They kind of just lose the will to live. They lose their sense of purpose. I mean, it's funny. We are identified, if you think about it, by what we are.
Absolutely.
We need an identity, and if we don't have an identity, we become far less productive as human beings. So, no, I think what we'll find is displacement through AI, but I think other forms of work will come along.
Well, the question probably on a lot of people's minds is this. Turn the clock back to 2016. If you had to do Brexit all over again, would you still do it?
Well, turn the clock back to 1993. when
half our audience wasn't even here then.
I know, because that's when it started. That was when the obsession started. That was when the madness began with me. No, that was when I decided I've got to make a stand. I've got to do something. And what I was fighting against, we now know as globalism. It was this idea that you give up control of your life. You give up control of the levers over your life. And that really is what national sovereignty is. National sovereignty is the idea, certainly the Western idea, that through your vote, you can influence the people directly in charge of your life, the people in charge of interest rates, the people in charge of tax rates, the people in charge of the rules and regulations by which we have to live socially and commercially. And so I was opposed to the transference of that, not just to a foreign power, but to a foreign bureaucracy. So, 1993 to 2016, without ever stopping. I never took a break. I never took any time away. I just kept plugging away. I don't believe it can ever be wrong to have freedom. And whether that's individual freedom, whether it's freedom for your family, whether it's freedom for your country to make decisions, that must always be the right thing to do. What I regret is that the British political establishment didn't want this result to happen, never accepted the result, never saw it for a minute as an opportunity, but as a damaged limitation exercise. There are some things we've done that are good. I think the AUKUS deal is a very good deal, and that's the deal with us, the Americans, and the Australians. The Australians had these absolutely useless, out-of-date French diesel-powered submarines, and they're going to be replaced by nuclear submarines, which means they can stay submerged, which means it's much more difficult for the Chinese Navy to spot where they are and what they're doing. that's an example in foreign policy terms of something we couldn't have done as a member of the European Union, because we'd have had to, we had to have shown solidarity to our friends, for their outdated technology. But in terms of controlling borders, in terms of immigration being selective, in that you think immigration is a good thing, but you need the right people to come, that are going to bring a positive benefit, integrate, then we failed dramatically. But the other big failure is, I think, everybody that's an entrepreneur, and I apply the term entrepreneur to taxi drivers, to people running, sole traders, to computer techs, who probably can work from home, all the way through. I think everyone thought that being away from the grip of corporate law, which is what Brussels is all about, it's all about big multinationals setting the rules for their own industry. I think everyone thought maybe their lives would get a little bit easier, and in fact they probably got worse. So to that extent, many people feel Brexit's been betrayed. I would say it's been delayed. We're still going to get those freedoms, but not just yet.
You bring up immigration. This is a huge issue in the West. As I look at Europe, I see what are deemed far-right parties.
Oh, we're all far right.
Yes,
So
yes.
unless we're radical left,
Because
we're
you
all
don't
far.
because you don't agree with the establishment. But let's say right of center parties.
Yeah.
That 20 years ago would have been agreed with by the establishment, at least in the U.S. But now immigration has run amok, yet the leftist governments are still pretty much in charge throughout most of the West. How does this work when it's so obviously a problem to the citizenry of these countries? And I talk about Sweden recently, or the Germans, the French, to some extent, your own country. I think it's a huge issue in the United States. 10 million in the last 4 years.
Well, that's
so why is it the left party stay in charge when everybody's against this sort of thing,
Well-
or a large plurality?
Well, America is the worst example of all, because it's 10 million that have crossed the border. It's not even legal immigration, it's illegal immigration.
Yes.
That America seems to be accepting. Do you know Eisenhower, when he was president, deported 1 million people who'd come illegally? That was no problem then, because if you wanted to go to America, you had to go through the hoops and do the thing properly and do the thing legally. And it's a miracle to me. It's a miracle to me that the Dems are still neck and neck with the Republicans as we run up to November the 5th. No, I think what you're seeing in Europe is much more fundamental than perhaps you analyse. I think the penny is dropping in European countries that the mass importation of cultures that in some cases are diametrically opposed to what we would consider to be modern Western values, and that means in particular attitudes towards women. I think that's the really big one.
Sweden's the poster child for that.
Well, absolutely. And I think these new right-wing parties, centre-right parties, many of whom, as you quite rightly say, wouldn't have been considered to be right-wing at all 20 years ago. It would have been mainstream conservatism. But so far has the centre of gravity of debate shifted to the left. And this is because of two things. One, it's the virus of Marxism. And the virus of Marxism mutates and comes back every 20 or 30 years in different ways. It used to be about class and money. The Tsar's got all these wonderful palaces, and we must tear down the regime. And now they use race. Now they use race, just as they used to use class. And so avowedly Marxist organizations that wish to destroy everything the West stands for, such as Black Lives Matter, are lauded by the New York Times, by CNN, as if somehow these are wonderful organizations promoting harmony and peace, when actually all they're doing is promoting division. And I think the problem with all of this is that aligned to the kind of pylons that you get on social media, I think the reason we've moved so far that way, I blame conservative cowardice. We have not had conservative politicians prepared to stand up and take the abuse. And believe you me, the levels of abuse you get now from the well-funded, organised left are of a different magnitude to anything we've seen before in politics. And the abuse comes with threats and intimidation as well. Physical threats and intimidation. I know more about this. I've been attacked so many times, over and over and over. You know, people throwing drinks in your face, stuff like that. And some of it you've seen on television. Most of it you haven't.
Yeah.
Most of it you haven't. So I think what's happening is the public are waking up to the fact that actually this clash of cultures is really very bad news. And I think you're going to see very big change. I think Marine Le Pen will become president of France in 2027. I have little doubt that will happen. If you look at Giorgia Meloni, who's the Prime Minister of Italy, when she was elected, the global press had the screaming abdabs. But actually, what's she done? Very decent, very respectable.
You don't hear about her anymore.
Well, that's right, because she's doing a good job. You're absolutely right. In Hungary, you have a very conservative leader in the shape of Viktor Orban, who gets re-elected time after time after time. I mean, he gets 50% of the vote in a multi-party system. It's quite extraordinary, totally extraordinary. Our Labour government, by the way, only got 34% of the vote, and yet they have a big majority under our system.
Isn't that amazing? So many prime ministers around the world on 34, 35%, and they're in power.
Yeah, well, it all depends on electoral systems. You know, the American system is the old-fashioned absolutist, two parties, winner take all. And yeah, you get, you know, a libertarian stands and a green stands, but you basically become American president on 48% of the vote.
Yeah.
You know,
And 270 electoral votes.
Yeah, and that's the way it's been for a very, very long time. So now I think that the political shift that is taking place in Europe will continue. And I think Italy shows you the way it's going to go.
Let's talk about immigration in a moment. I mean, politicians are politicians, excuse me. They're there to stay in power. Not anti-establishment like you.
No, there are two types of people in politics. Two very distinct types of people in politics. There are those who are in politics to be something, and that I think is what you're referring to.
Yes, yeah.
And there are those who are in politics to do something.
Yeah.
Probably the split is about 3-1. I would say that
in favor of the latter.
In favor of the careerists.
Yes.
You know, and politics, as you know, right across the West has increasingly been dominated by people who've had no real life or no big achievements outside of the political arena.
Well, why would you want to put up with what you put up with if you're somebody with any kind of stature? So it's going to get to the lowest common denominator over time.
Yeah, it's going that way.
Why do I want my family to go through this, the average person's going to say.
Yes, they are, and it's that, it's media intrusion, it's funny, people in elected politics either are on the biggest money they'll ever earn or are taking gigantic cuts to do it. You can guess which category I've been in.
Well, okay, so let's go back and talk about the politicians that want to stay in power forevermore. Is the calculus on the immigration issue, we will get more votes by taking the stand we have taken? Or is it a little bit more sinister in that they're really trying to trash the system?
Well, Tony Blair won a big electoral victory in 1997 and opened the doors to legal immigration in a way we'd never seen the likes of. And his close advisors said, we want to rub the noses of the right in diversity, which meant they actually wanted to fundamentally change the character of British nationality through immigration. They willfully and deliberately set out to do that. And this is partly motivated by a kind of self-loathing. It's something that George Orwell wrote about in the late 1940s. I don't think it's unique to Britain either. This idea that you look back at your national history and rather being proud of the journey that your forebears were on through all of their triumphs and tragedies that they went through. We're basically proud of who we are, we're proud of our nation, we're proud of our families' role in it.
Warts and all.
Warts and all, because of course it wasn't perfect, and don't forget we have different moral judgments. Hey, we have different moral judgments today to 20 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. And no doubt people will look back on us in 50 years as barbarians. You know, I mean, that's just the way that it is. Or you belong to the school of thought that says this is loathsome. And what we've seen, and it goes back to the start of the conversation actually about education, we have seen the march of the left through the academic institutions, both sides of the pond, and this has happened to the most remarkable degree. Kind of university lecturers were always tended to be a bit lefty, but now they tend to be quite hard lefty.
And not taken seriously.
And they're now, I'm afraid our kids are being poisoned. Yeah. They're being told everything about our past is awful. And this is, you know, Mr. Soros funds all sorts of organizations that make children doubt the history of the country, divide children up into making white children think they're oppressors, black children think they're victims, which, by the way, is a dreadful thing to do to kids aged 7 or 8 years old. I mean, it is absolutely, truly awful. They even make kids doubt their own sexuality, way before these children have even had sexual thoughts or got anywhere near puberty. So these are the sick things that have been going on in our societies.
Question. Is the biggest threat to the West us? You know, we have met the enemy and they are us. Or is it some foreign adversary in the near to medium term future?
Yeah, I've pondered this. I've pondered this question, but I've pondered this question so long and hard, year after year after year. And I think the answer is the former. I think the biggest enemy is us, because it's us. It's us losing our sense of who we are, us losing our sense of what national identity means, us losing our sense of what community means, us losing our sense of why family actually is really very, very important and shouldn't be underestimated. And it's because of that loss in our leaders of a sort of collective sense of confidence in who we are that has allowed our enemies to become stronger. Best example. America had 3,000 troops left in Afghanistan. They were no longer engaged in active combat. No American soldier had been killed for the previous 18 months. The Americans and the Brits, by the way, who pro rata for population were there in the same numbers, took the same losses and spent the same money. You know, side by side with our American allies for 20 years. And unilaterally, a weak American leader, Joe Biden, decides he's going to withdraw the American troops without any thought for consulting his mates, the British, well, of course he doesn't like us anyway, without any thought for the equipment that was there, without any thought for how the withdrawal from Kabul, from Afghanistan, would go. I think that's the biggest single foreign policy mistake I've seen made in my lifetime. It led to, well, not just...
Well, certainly since Vietnam.
Certainly since Vietnam, which the Brits, by the way, said no to. One thing Harold Wilson, as the Labour Prime Minister, got right. And America left behind $85 billion worth of grade A kit. There were unnecessary deaths in getting out. The Taliban was back in charge within a week. And I do not believe that Putin would have invaded Ukraine if he hadn't seen that sense of weakness from the West. So we are our own worst enemies, or better put, there is an enemy within that is destroying us.
Suicide of the West.
It is the suicide of the West, but I have some hope. The hope that I have is that we're seeing political changes already. As we've
Describe those, please.
Well, the political changes we're seeing are, as I say, Italy, where France is going, and those things are encouraging. And I think the public are ready for a lot more of that change over the course of the next few years. And the other interesting thing is this. The millennials are gone. I mean, they're gone. Waste of space. They don't believe it. You know, it's all about work-life balance, and you know, Gen Z's different. Really interesting. The 16 to 24-year-olds I'm meeting, I'm seeing, they're very different.
In what way?
Oh wow, they're just rejecting all this stuff. I mean, not en masse, but a significant
A plurality.
a huge number of these young people are saying the hell with that. They're challenging what their teachers are telling them. My social media following among them is absolutely remarkable. It was said that one of the primary things that Keir Starmer would do early as Prime Minister is reduce the voting age from 18 to 16.
Oh, maybe he better not.
And now he's decided not to do it because he's worried about Farage and he's worried about how these guys... So I think there is a generational shift. And I'm beginning to see a bit more ambition. I'm beginning to see a bit more sense of identity in this younger generation. And it is that younger generation that is powering the Le Pen vote in France. It is that younger generation that is powering the AfD in Germany, who, by the way, are a mixed bag. I mean, genuinely, a very, very mixed bag. So I do see some hope. I do see some hope. I also think, you know, if you take the long historical view, there are pendulums that swing back and forth through the centuries. The pendulum is swinging back against ESG investing.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, that's happening in a big, big way. I think
But don't you think under the surface they're still practicing some of that? Just maybe not so blatantly in your face.
I think it's the other way round.
Really?
Yeah, I think when they were professing to be doing it, they weren't always doing it.
So it's virtue signaling.
I think it's the other way round. It's very interesting. I mean, Glencore, the biggest mining, corporation in the world, recently asked their London shareholders, institutions mostly, whether they should sell the coal division. And the answer came back, no, keep the coal division, it's the best bit you've got. So we're seeing change on that. We are seeing a change on some of the trans lunacy. Now look, let people be what they are. There've always been a tiny percentage of people who felt they were in the wrong bodies, and we should have sympathy for them and love for them. All right, and I genuinely mean that. I really do. But the idea, that somebody who's been through male puberty and is 6'3" can suddenly put a dress on and say, I want to be a swimmer, against female athletes. Some of that madness we're now seeing in the pendulum shift, and sports are now taking a more responsible attitude. So I think there is, already I see signs. I genuinely believe that we've reached peak woke. I think there is now a little bit more of a shift towards common sense. And I say that not just out of hope, but just witnessing.
Well, you're seeing the public all the time. You're interacting every day.
Yeah. So there is a shift going on. There is a shift going on. Now, there are...
But are we too far down the rabbit hole?
Well, this worries me. I mean, the embedding of radical Islam in some of Britain's towns and cities worries me very greatly. Very greatly. Whilst the vast majority of the Muslim population in Britain are integrated, their kids play with our kids, they will play soccer or whatever it is, and a lot of these Muslim people have done very well, and they're doctors and they're lawyers, and that's great. But we need their help. We need their help very badly.
To stand up.
Absolutely.
For the culture.
Absolutely. Because a worrying 25% of young Muslim men living in Britain think jihad is an acceptable concept. That worries me very, very greatly. That is a problem that Sweden, Britain, Germany, France, we're going to face that for decades to come. That is not a problem that can change overnight. That is not a simple swing of the pendulum. So that concerns me very deeply. Many of the other malaises, I think, can be fought, although economically, you do wonder with, ratios of debt GDP.
Well over 100%.
Yeah, I mean we've just gone through 100.
Yeah. Well, and the only thing I'll push back on, I mean, I agree with you. It's a major concern of mine, but look at Japan. They're 250% of GDP, have been for years, and they're still around.
Yeah, well, maybe, maybe we're wrong. Maybe you can just live like this forever, but I don't think you can.
Why don't we abolish taxes and just print money, and the government has everything they need, and I'm deadly serious about that.
Well,
if we can print what we need, why do we have to pay taxes?
Modern monetary
Modern
theory.
monetary theory,
Yeah,
yes.
cobblers. I just don't believe any of it ultimately.
No, I think it's ridiculous, but so far, nothing bad's happened.
Well, 2008, was a very big wake-up call.
You mean with the great financial crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And another one's coming. I don't know when it's going to be.
Yeah.
Look, I tell you what, I think the gold price is telling us
tells you
something.
everything. As I tell people, Bob, they'll say, Bob, aren't you a little bit too gloomy? All right, I'll put aside for a moment everything that I read in the news. It's very political sometimes. People either agree or disagree, and sometimes vehemently so. I'll say, consider the price of gold.
Yeah.
I look at that, it's apolitical.
Yeah.
Tells me something is wrong.
I agree totally. I've been saying this for a year or more. It's actually it's funny, isn't it, really? When you look at gold, I think it still looks cheap. No, I do. I'm being serious.
Well, if the West, back on the West again, because as you pointed out earlier, the wealth, the influence, the powers moving from west to east.
Yep.
So is the gold buying.
Yeah.
The Westerners are complacent. They're not buying gold. If they ever do, the thing's going to go parabolic.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, our moron, Gordon Brown, who subscribed to the view that gold was a barbarous relic, sold 400 metric tons of gold. That was
At what price?
258. And he announced to the world how much he was selling and on what dates he'd sell it. That was in the late 90s. I mean, you can't believe it.
Yeah.
So the gold price tells me there's a major financial shock to come.
Well, it's geopolitical probably, but I have to believe it's mostly financial.
It's coming, and when it does come, that will then accelerate the pace of political change.
Of all the change.
The only worry I have, and I'm going to talk about this later on today, is whilst we are seeing a move towards conservatism across Europe, they're all big state conservatives.
Same in the U.S., I think.
Yeah, they're big state
I
conservatives.
never hear the right-leaning parties in your country or in the U.S. talk about the free market anymore.
Well,
and that concerns me.
Yeah, well, that's where we're different. That's where reform is different, because we believe in entrepreneurship. Yeah. We believe in entrepreneurship, and we hate the fact that global corporations are now more powerful than governments. They influence legislation to the most incredible degree. And the more the rule book suits the big guys, the less it suits the little guys. And I genuinely think that real economic growth, which, by the way, the West has hardly any of.
No.
Hardly any. If it wasn't for the current account deficit, there wouldn't be any growth at all.
Well, the only reason we have growth in the U.S. this year is they have a $2 trillion deficit to keep it afloat.
Exactly. So I do believe in entrepreneurship. I do think the state is way too big. And that kind of makes me stand out against the other conservative type politicians across Europe. Culturally, I'm with them. Economically, I have a different vision.
Isn't it interesting? I'm a little bit older than you are, but in my generation, when I was coming of age, the left detested the major corporations. And they were all for free speech.
Yeah.
Today, 50 years later, they're voting for the party that embraces the multinational corporations and wants to censor speech at every turn.
Oh, yes.
How does that happen?
I know. And your middle or middle upper class person that would have been conservative is now probably quite a radical green liberal. And your working class geezer, who would have been Labour, is now on the right.
Yeah, the coal miners are voting for the center-right parties
today. They are. And interestingly, the old coal mining communities are socially the most conservative. They're the strongest believers in family, in community. They understand the role of the church. and what it plays with. So yeah, things have changed in the most remarkable way.
I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you brought it up quickly. The role of the church, it seems to be diminishing in the West. Does that have something to do about all the problems we're talking about?
Whatever your religious conviction, what is absolutely a fact is that it is Judeo-Christian culture and values that have underpinned everything the West has stood for 2,000 years. You know, the Ten Commandments. Well, if you think about it, you know, the Ten Commandments still underpin pretty much everything that we've built and we believe in. And it's as if people are ashamed to stand up and say it. Ashamed, it's kind of, we need to put this to the back. And I think we've become pretty irreligious, pretty godless. I think cultural Christianity is vital. I think, you know, believe what you want to believe individually, but understand why this matters. And there is a new religion that's exploding. It's called global warming. It's called the belief in net zero. It's called the, we mustn't produce oil anymore. And this, honestly, this has become a fundamental belief system for a growing number of people, especially young people, but not wholly
Well,
young
and
people.
the more well-to-do in the United States, I saw a poll this year that showed that the people with postgraduate degrees who are so diametrically opposed to the middle class are all for shutting down airplane rides, shutting down anything that has to do with oil. And I would think that ultimately their economic well-being is more at risk, because without those things, how can you have a growing economy?
Yeah.
So it has to be something other than the economy.
Yeah.
And it appears that, to your point, it's probably some sort of zealotry, call it a pagan religion if you want to.
Well, it is actually, if you think about it, very pagan.
Yeah.
No, and I mean, they are oblivious to the fact that here we are in Malaysia. I mean, what's powering all these lights? Coal.
Yes.
Coal.
And they had to bring it back in Germany
Coal.
too, because the other stuff wouldn't work,
Yeah,
right?
oh, yeah,
The
and
renewables.
And in Germany's case, lignite,
Yeah.
which really is quite a polluting sulfurous coal. The Chinese build a few wind turbines to make us all feel happy, but actually are opening 60 to 80
Every year.
brand new coal-fired power stations every year. Modi, who was just re-elected in India, just about re-elected in India, one of his boasts in the election campaign is this year we produced 1 billion tons of coal. Do you know, in 2024, this statistic's amazing. In 2024, the world will burn 8 billion tons of coal.
Where's that stack up historically?
You just kind of get...
Is that the most ever?
It's the record.
Yeah.
The record. Whilst the West says, "Oh, aren't we lovely? Aren't we?" Yeah. So look, you know, are we concerned about the environment and our air and our seas and what we leave our kids? Of course we are. Of course we are. But what is being done in the name of achieving low carbon net zero is absolutely catastrophic for the West. And no country has suffered it worse than mine. We have reduced carbon dioxide emissions by 50% since 1990. Do you know how we've done it? By closing everything. In the last 2 weeks, we've had the major steelworks in South Wales close, and the firm announced those jobs are going to India. We've had the largest refinery in Britain announce it's going to close. We've had a new anthracite mine refuse permission to open, and it looks like the North Sea could close down with a loss of 250,000 jobs.
For oil.
To reduce our carbon emissions, to show the world what lovely people we are.
So who would be opposed to cleaner energy? I can't imagine anybody would be. So I don't know, is 2050 the year? Is it 2060 or 2075? The renewables, I mean, we're not anywhere near the point where we can run an economy on this.
No.
Why don't we let the free market work? My view is, and I have no idea what the solution is at this point, but if we let the free market work somewhere, could be the US, could be Great Britain, could be somewhere in Asia, maybe we'll make some sort of a discovery. I mean, after all, 40 years ago, whoever envisioned the internet, and look at how that's changed, because that was somebody that was given some sort of incentive to produce something that made lives better. Can't we come up with something so that we don't have to have these draconian points of view as to, getting rid of the internal combustion engine before we have anything to replace it, for heaven's sake?
Yeah, listen, without subsidy, renewables wouldn't exist.
Well, of course not.
That's what's been funding this all the way through. That is what the Biden so-called
Well,
Inflation
Janet
Reduction
Yellen
Act-
said it's $78 trillion. We're going to have to throw $78 trillion at it over the next 30 years.
Yeah,
We don't have $78 trillion.
and also for a form of intermittent energy. That's the problem. It's the intermittency that is the problem. We haven't solved the battery problem. It doesn't exist without vast government subsidies. And all the evidence is it leads to consumers having higher prices.
Yes.
So I agree with you. I'm not against it. If it works and the free market can make this work, that's just fantastic.
That'd be wonderful.
I'd be over the moon if that's the case, but it just sadly isn't.
I think we're out of time.
That's a bore.
We could go on.
That's a bore.
Nigel Farage, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
as ever, Bob. Thank you.